How does a single sentence buried in a constitution become a weapon? How can a safety valve designed for the ultimate emergency be twisted into an instrument of destruction? In 1930, the German Republic was about to learn this lesson, one written in ink, soon to be rewritten in blood. President Hindenburg thought he was saving his country from chaos. He had no idea he was writing the instruction manual for its demolition. The year is 1930. The world is broken. The glittering decade of the 1920s ended not with a party, but with a crash. A stock market collapse in New York sent a shock wave across the globe, and it hit Germany like a tidal wave. The nation was already fragile, built on the ashes of a lost war and mountains of foreign debt. Now that foundation was cracking. Factories fell silent. Banks locked their doors. The unemployment line snaked through every city, a daily reminder of a promise betrayed. 6 million people without work. In the cold apartments of Berlin, in the quiet towns of Bavaria, a single question echoed. Who can save us? The government, the democratically elected Reichstag, was paralyzed. Imagine a room filled with people who despise each other, forced to agree on how to save a burning building. On one side, the communists, who wanted to tear the whole structure down and build a new one in Moscow's image. On the other, a small but growing party of extremists, the National Socialists, led by Adolf Hitler. They too wanted to burn it all down, but for a very different future. In the middle, a dozen splintered parties fought for their own piece of a shrinking pie. They couldn't agree on a budget. They couldn't agree on taxes. They couldn't agree on anything. Democracy was failing because it required conversation, and Germany had forgotten how to talk. It only knew how to shout. The man in charge of this chaos was Chancellor Heinrich Brüning, a cold academic man, an economist who saw the nation not as a people, but as a balance sheet. His solution was brutal austerity. Cut government spending, cut wages, cut pensions. He believed that to save the patient, he had to inflict immense pain. The Reichstag naturally refused. To vote for Brüning's budget was to commit political suicide. Their constituents were starving, and the chancellor was offering them a smaller plate. The budget was dead on arrival. The government was in gridlock. The system had failed. And this is where the old man enters the picture. President Paul von Hindenburg, 82 years old, a field marshal from the Great War, a living symbol of a Germany that no longer existed. He was a monarchist at heart, a man who saw the messy, loud democracy of the Weimar Republic with contempt. He saw the Reichstag's paralysis not as a political problem, but as a moral failure. He believed Germany needed a firm hand, not an endless debate. And the Constitution gave him one. It was called Article 48, a small paragraph intended for moments of grave national danger, an invasion, a civil war. It gave the president the power to rule by emergency decree. If Parliament wouldn't pass a law, the president could sign his name and make it law anyway. It was the system's emergency override, the ultimate constitutional power, meant to be a shield to protect the republic. But a shield, in the wrong hands, can be used as a club. Brüning went to Hindenburg. He explained the situation. The budget was rejected. The country was drifting towards collapse. The politicians were squabbling. He presented the president with a choice. Let the nation descend into chaos or use the power you have. For Hindenburg, it wasn't a choice at all. He had a duty. He saw it as his responsibility to restore order, the same way a general restores order on a chaotic battlefield. So he took the pen. With a single signature, Hindenburg did two things. First, he enacted Brüning's entire austerity budget as an emergency decree. The law that Parliament had rejected was now the law of the land. The will of the people's representatives was irrelevant. Second, he dissolved the Reichstag. He sent the politicians home. He believed a new election would punish the extremists and return a more sensible, moderate majority. He thought he was resetting the system. He was actually rigging it to explode. Imagine the arrogance, the belief that you can simply dismiss democracy when it becomes inconvenient, that you can silence the voices of the people for their own good. Hindenburg and his circle of conservative elites were convinced they were the adults in the room, saving the children from their own foolishness. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. The election campaign of 1930 was not a debate over policy. It was a war for the soul of Germany. The streets became the stage. The established parties ran their usual boring campaigns with pamphlets and stuffy speeches. But the extremists understood the new reality. They understood the anger. The communists promised a workers' revolution, their red flags filling the working-class districts as their militants clashed violently with the police. But it was the Nazis who truly mastered the art of desperation. They didn't offer complex economic plans. They offered something much more powerful, a scapegoat and a savior. Their propaganda was everywhere. Posters depicted Hitler as a messianic figure. His voice, thanks to modern radio and loudspeakers, was inescapable. He didn't talk about budgets or taxes. He talked about betrayal, humiliation, and national pride. He promised jobs. He promised to tear up the hated Treaty of Versailles. He promised to restore order. And he promised to punish those responsible for Germany's suffering. While Brüning governed by decree from a silent office in Berlin, Hitler was on the move. He traveled by airplane, a novelty at the time, speaking to massive, hysterical crowds in dozens of cities. He was a force of nature, channeling the nation's rage and giving it a target. He was selling a simple, brutal, and intoxicating story, and a desperate nation was ready to buy it. September 14th, 1930. The election results started to come in. In the halls of government, there was a quiet confidence. They expected small gains for the extremists, nothing they couldn't handle. Then the numbers from the provinces arrived. Then the cities. The quiet confidence turned to unease. The unease turned to shock. The shock turned to pure dread. The Nazis had not made small gains. They had caused a political earthquake. In the last election 2 years prior, they had won just 12 seats in the Reichstag. They were a fringe party, a joke. Now, the results were clear. 107 seats. They were the second largest party in the country. Their vote share had exploded by over 800%. Hindenburg and Brüning had tried to solve a deadlocked parliament by calling an election. The result was a new parliament not just deadlocked, but filled with deputies openly committed to destroying democracy itself. Their attempt to create stability had resulted in the greatest surge of political extremism the country had ever seen. They had played with fire, and now the whole house was burning. They had used Article 48 to show that a chancellor could govern without Parliament. They intended it as a temporary fix, a tool to get past a crisis. But they had shown everyone the way. They had revealed a fatal flaw in the system. The emergency powers were not a bug. They were a feature. And now a new player was on the board. A man who had just won millions of votes by promising to burn the old world down. He was watching, he was learning, and he was wondering what he could do with a president's blank check. Imagine your life savings have vanished. You have no job. Your government is paralyzed. Then a man walks on stage and promises to fix everything. In the September 1930 election, millions of Germans decided to listen. The Reichstag was gone, dissolved by the pen of an old field marshal. Chancellor Brüning was ruling by decree, a temporary fix that felt dangerously permanent. Germany was hurtling toward a new election, one born from failure in a nation holding its breath. The air was thick with the smell of cheap coal and simmering anger. 6 million Germans were unemployed. That's nearly 1 in 3 workers. Families were being thrown from their homes. Farmers were losing their land. The vibrant, chaotic culture of the Weimar Republic was being suffocated by a poverty so deep it felt like a terminal illness. Into this vacuum of hope stepped the political parties. The traditional ones, the Social Democrats and the Center Party, went about business as usual. They printed thoughtful pamphlets filled with complex economic theories. Their leaders gave calm, reasonable speeches in half-empty halls. They spoke of patience, of stability, of upholding the Constitution, but to a man who can't feed his children, the Constitution is just a piece of paper. Then there were the extremists. On the far left, the communists saw the crisis as the final death rattle of capitalism. Their message was revolution. Tear it all down. Their red flags filled the working-class districts of Berlin. Their street fighters, the Red Front, clashed daily with the police and their rivals. They promised a new world, a workers' paradise modeled on the Soviet Union. For many, this was terrifying. For others, it was the only real alternative. But on the far right, another party was mastering a new kind of politics. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. In 1928, they were a joke, a tiny fringe group with only 12 seats in the Reichstag. By 1930, no one was laughing anymore. Their leader, Adolf Hitler, saw the nation's despair not as a problem, but as an opportunity, the perfect fuel for his political engine. The Nazi campaign was unlike anything Germany had ever seen. It wasn't a political debate, it was a spectacle, a carefully staged drama of national salvation. Joseph Goebbels, the party's master propagandist, understood something the other parties did not. Politics was no longer about appealing to reason. It was about conquering the soul. So they flooded the country not with pamphlets, but with images. Posters were everywhere. A heroic worker breaking the chains of servitude, a determined soldier staring toward a golden dawn, and above all, Hitler's face, his eyes seeming to stare right through you, promising order, strength, and revenge. They organized massive rallies that felt more like religious revivals. Thousands of men in brown uniforms marched with military precision. Torches cut through the night. Swastika banners, vast seas of red, white, and black, hung from every building. And then Hitler would speak. He didn't debate fiscal policy or offer a five-point plan. He painted a picture of a Germany betrayed by the politicians who signed the Treaty of Versailles, betrayed by international bankers, betrayed by Marxists and Jews, who he claimed were stabbing the nation in the back. His voice would start low, a conspiratorial whisper, then build in volume and fury until it became a volcanic roar of pure, distilled rage. He wasn't just talking to the crowd, he was screaming their own frustrations back at them. He gave their nameless fear a name. He gave their silent suffering a voice. To the unemployed factory worker, he promised a job. To the bankrupt shopkeeper, he promised to crush the big department stores. To the humiliated war veteran, he promised to tear up the treaty and rebuild the army. To the conservative farmer, he promised to restore traditional values. To everyone, he promised to restore their pride. He offered simple solutions to complex problems. He offered scapegoats instead of policies. He offered a single, powerful idea that one man, one movement, could make Germany strong again. The established parties watched this with a mix of contempt and disbelief. They called him a clown, a vulgar beer hall demagogue. They assumed the German people, civilized and educated, would see through the act. They fatally underestimated the power of desperation. They thought they were in a political contest. Hitler knew he was in a holy war. September 14th, 1930, Election Day. The votes were cast and the counting began. In the headquarters of the Social Democrats, the mood was tense but confident. They expected to lose some seats, but to remain the largest party. The first results trickled in. The Nazis were doing well, a little too well. Then more results came. The trickle became a flood. In newsrooms across Berlin, journalists stared at the numbers in stunned silence. It couldn't be right. There had to be a mistake. There was no mistake. The Nazi Party had won 6.4 million votes. They went from 12 seats in the Reichstag to 107. Overnight, they had become the second largest political party in Germany. The fringe had become a phenomenon. The joke had become a threat. Hitler himself was reportedly surprised by the sheer scale of the victory. His gamble had paid off beyond his wildest dreams. The world looked on in horror. Democracies weren't supposed to vote for their own destruction. But the Weimar Republic was a democracy in name only. Its heart had been weakened by years of crisis, and now a virus had entered its bloodstream. 107 deputies dressed in their brown uniforms would soon be marching into the Reichstag. They weren't there to debate or legislate. They had publicly sworn to paralyze and dismantle the very institution they were entering. The respectable politicians of Berlin now faced a monster of their own making. The emergency decrees, the dissolved parliament, the election they thought would bring stability. It had all backfired spectacularly. They had hoped to tame the political fringe. Instead, they had invited it into the center of power. The question facing them was terrifyingly simple. How do you govern when more than 100 of your lawmakers are sworn to destroy the system itself? The fate of Germany wasn't decided in Parliament. It wasn't decided in the streets, not yet. It was decided by a few men in smoke-filled rooms, driven by personal ambition and petty revenge. They were the old guard, the aristocrats and generals who despised the messy business of democracy, and they thought they could outsmart the man with the funny mustache. They believed they could use his movement, his energy, his voters, and then discard him like a broken tool. The Nazi Party was now a giant in the Reichstag, with 107 seats. But real power didn't sit in that chamber. It resided with one man, the 83-year-old president, Paul von Hindenburg, a relic of the old German Empire, a field marshal who saw politicians as little more than noisy civilians. Around him was an inner circle, a gentleman's club of unelected advisors who were really running the country. At the center of this web was General Kurt von Schleicher. He was the ultimate backroom operator, a political general who fought his wars not on the battlefield, but in the corridors of power. Schleicher was clever, cynical, and utterly convinced of his own genius. He saw Germany as a chessboard, and he was the Grand Master. His goal was simple: restore authoritarian rule, with the army back at the center of the state. And the Nazis? He saw them not as a threat, but as a useful mob, a battering ram he could aim at his enemies. Chancellor Brüning was still in office, but he was a dead man walking. His austerity measures were hated, and he governed only because Hindenburg signed his emergency decrees. Schleicher decided Brüning's time was up. He whispered in the old president's ear that Brüning was weak, that he was failing. A new man was needed, and Schleicher had just the man in mind, someone he thought he could control. His name was Franz von Papen, a wealthy, charming aristocrat with a talent for horse riding and social climbing. He was vain, impeccably dressed, and politically insignificant. In other words, he was perfect. A respectable face for Schleicher's government. In May 1932, Brüning was dismissed, and von Papen became the new chancellor. His cabinet was filled with so many nobles, it was nicknamed the Cabinet of Barons. It had no popular support. It was Schleicher's puppet government. Now came the first move. Papen couldn't pass a single law without the Nazis, so he and Schleicher arranged a meeting with Hitler. They made him an offer. Bring your movement into the fold, and you will be made vice-chancellor. It seemed like a generous proposition, a seat at the table of power. Hitler's response was not what they expected. He didn't negotiate. He didn't haggle. He exploded. He told them he didn't want a piece of the pie. He wanted the whole bakery. He demanded the chancellorship, all or nothing. Papen was stunned. Schleicher was intrigued. They had misjudged their man. This was not a pawn to be moved around the board. This was a player who wanted to flip the entire table. They refused him. Papen, with Hindenburg's blessing, dissolved the Reichstag and called for new elections in July 1932. The campaign was brutal. The streets became battlegrounds. As Nazi stormtroopers and communist paramilitaries fought pitched battles, the country was tearing itself apart. Through it all, Hitler campaigned like a man possessed, flying across the country for massive rallies, his voice crackling over radios in every town square. The results were a political earthquake. The Nazi Party more than doubled its seats to 230. They were now by far the largest party in Germany. Hitler's gamble had paid off. His demand for the chancellorship was no longer the ranting of a radical. It was the claim of the most popular politician in the country. He was summoned to meet with President Hindenburg. Imagine the scene. The old ramrod-straight Prussian field marshal looking down his nose at the man he privately called the Bohemian Corporal. Hindenburg despised everything Hitler stood for: the noise, the vulgarity, the mob politics. He offered Hitler the vice-chancellorship again, telling him it was his patriotic duty to serve under a gentleman like von Papen. Hitler stood his ground. He looked the legendary war hero in the eye and said no. He repeated his demand, all or nothing. Hindenburg was furious. He lectured Hitler on his responsibilities, accused him of disloyalty, and dismissed him like a disobedient schoolboy. The meeting was over. The door to power had been slammed in Hitler's face. The elites in Berlin breathed a sigh of relief. They believed Hitler had overplayed his hand and missed his chance. But von Papen remained chancellor, weak, isolated, and still ruling by decree without a majority. In a desperate move, he called for yet another election in November 1932, the third in less than a year. This time, something was different. The Nazi propaganda machine was sputtering, running out of money. The party was deep in debt. The voters were exhausted by the constant chaos. Was Hitler's appeal starting to fade? The results came in, and for the first time, the Nazi momentum broke. They lost 2 million votes. Their seat count dropped from 230 to 196. They were still the largest party, but they were wounded. The magic seemed to be gone. Inside Nazi headquarters, there was panic. Some of Hitler's top lieutenants began to question his all-or-nothing strategy. Maybe they should have taken the deal. Back in the gentlemen's club, there was a sense of triumph. General von Schleicher saw his moment. He went to Hindenburg and delivered the final knife to his own puppet. Papen has failed, he argued. He has no path forward. There is only one man who can control the situation now: me. Hindenburg agreed. Franz von Papen was forced to resign, humiliated and bitter. In December 1932, General Kurt von Schleicher, the master of the back rooms, finally took the prize for himself. He became Chancellor of Germany. He was supremely confident. He had a plan to split the Nazi Party, to peel away some of its members and bring them into his government. He believed he had finally cornered Hitler. He believed the threat was contained. Hitler was at his lowest point. His party was broke, his followers demoralized. The press was writing his political obituary. It looked like he was finished. It looked like the system had won. But what if your greatest ally isn't a friend, but an enemy's enemy? Franz von Papen was out of a job, his pride wounded, and burning with resentment for the man who had betrayed him. He was a man looking for revenge, and he was about to make a phone call. January 30th, 1933. In a secret meeting, a deal was struck to make Adolf Hitler chancellor. The man who brokered it, Franz von Papen, boasted to a friend, "In 2 months' time, we will have pushed him into a corner so that he squeaks. It was perhaps the single greatest miscalculation of the 20th century. The story of this deal begins not with Hitler, but with the man he replaced, General Kurt von Schleicher. The cunning general who had outmaneuvered everyone to become chancellor was now failing spectacularly. His plan to be a social general, uniting the country, had pleased no one. He tried to win over the trade unions, which angered the industrialists. He tried to split the Nazi Party, which only enraged Hitler. After just 57 days in office, Schleicher was politically isolated. His government was adrift, and in the shadows, his bitter rival was sharpening his knives. Franz von Papen could not forgive the betrayal. Schleicher, his own minister, had pushed him out of the chancellorship. Now, Papen was driven by a single, all-consuming desire: revenge. He didn't just want Schleicher to fail, he wanted to be the one to engineer his downfall, and he knew exactly which weapon to use. He would use the one man everyone in the elite circles feared and despised. He would use Adolf Hitler. On January 4th, 1933, a secret meeting took place in the Cologne home of the banker Kurt von Schröder. The air was thick with cigar smoke and conspiracy. On one side of the table sat Franz von Papen, the disgraced ex-chancellor. On the other, Adolf Hitler, the leader of the largest party in Germany. Between them sat the men who funded German industry. They were tired of the chaos, tired of the strikes. They saw the communists as a mortal threat, and they saw Hitler as the only man who could crush them. Papen laid out his proposal. He could make Hitler chancellor. He still had the ear of the one man who mattered, President Paul von Hindenburg. But there would be conditions. This would not be a Nazi government. It would be a coalition, a government of national concentration. Hitler would be the figurehead, the charismatic frontman, but the real power, the real control, would remain with the conservatives, with men like Papen. Hitler listened. For years he had demanded the chancellorship with no conditions. He had refused all lesser offers. But now he saw his moment. He saw the desperation in Papen's eyes. He saw the fear in the eyes of the industrialists. He agreed. The deal was struck. Papen would get his revenge. The industrialists would get a government that protected their interests. And Hitler would get the keys to the state. There was just one problem, a very big, very old problem: President Paul von Hindenburg. The 85-year-old field marshal despised Hitler. He called him the Bohemian corporal. He found him vulgar, loud, and utterly unfit for high office. He had met with him before and had been repulsed by his fanaticism. Hindenburg had sworn he would never, ever make this man the Chancellor of Germany. So, how do you convince an old soldier to break his oath? You don't persuade him. You corner him. Papen began a relentless campaign of pressure, not just on the president, but on his entire inner circle. He targeted Hindenburg's son, Oskar, a man with immense influence over his aging father. He targeted the president's state secretary, Otto Meissner. The message was always the same. First, they sold it as a cage. The argument was simple. Look at the proposed cabinet. Hitler would be chancellor, yes, but Franz von Papen would be vice-chancellor, at his side in every meeting, his shadow. Of the other ministers, only two would be Nazis, Wilhelm Frick and Hermann Göring. The other 8? They were Papen's men, Solid conservatives, patriots. They would control the economy, the foreign ministry, the army. Hitler would be completely boxed in, a chancellor in chains. Imagine the scene. An old man, his mind clouded by age, his body frail. He is told that the man he loathes can be tamed, that he can be used as a puppet to serve the interests of the old Germany he loves. Papen assured him, "We have hired him." It sounded so simple, so clever. Second, they stoked his deepest fears. General von Schleicher was failing. He was talking about dissolving the Reichstag again, ruling by decree, perhaps even using the army to establish a military dictatorship. This was anathema to Hindenburg, a man who saw himself as the guardian of the Constitution. And if Schleicher failed, what then? Civil war. The Communists and the Nazis would tear Germany apart on the streets. Papen presented his plan as the only path to stability, the only way to avoid bloodshed. His logic was seductive. Bring the Nazis into the tent. Give them responsibility. It will moderate them. It will defang them. It was a fatal misunderstanding of the predator they were inviting into their home. The final argument was an appeal to legacy. Hindenburg was a monument, a living symbol of the old empire. His allies convinced him that this one act, this one compromise, would secure his place in history. He would be the man who saved Germany from chaos, who united the right, who crushed the Marxists, and restored national pride. It was a siren song for a man obsessed with his own historical importance. Day after day the pressure mounted. Hindenburg wavered. He resisted. He complained. But he was tired. He was surrounded by voices all telling him the same thing. His son, his secretary, his friends, they all said this was the only way. Finally, on the morning of January 30th, 1933, he broke. He agreed. Adolf Hitler was summoned to the presidential palace. He walked into the room not as a revolutionary who had seized power, but as a politician who had been invited to it. He was appointed Chancellor of Germany legally, constitutionally, by the very man who held him in contempt. The elites who made it happen stood by, smiling. They believed they had just won the game. They thought they had put a leash on a wild animal. In reality, they had just handed him the whip, the chair, and the keys to the entire circus. That night, thousands of stormtroopers marched through the Brandenburg Gate in a massive torchlight parade. To them, this was not a backroom deal. It was a national awakening, a revolution. For the men in the government offices, the conservatives like Papen, it was just politics. They watched the parades and reassured themselves. Hitler was chancellor, yes, but his power was limited. He had a cabinet full of watchdogs. He had a constitution to obey. How could he possibly turn this weak, compromised position into a true dictatorship? They would soon find out. February 27th, 1933. The German Parliament building is on fire. Its massive glass dome glows orange against the Berlin night sky as flames chew through the ornate debating chamber. Before the ashes are even cold, Adolf Hitler has a document ready for President Hindenburg to sign. It's called the Decree for the Protection of People and State. It will suspend every major civil liberty in Germany indefinitely. Just 4 weeks into his chancellorship, Hitler was still in a precarious position. He led a coalition government surrounded by conservatives who thought they could control him. He needed a crisis, a moment of national panic so profound that the old rules would no longer seem to apply. That night, he got his wish. The first reports were chaotic. A lone arsonist was found inside the burning Reichstag. A young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe. For the Nazis, this was more than enough. Hitler, Vice-Chancellor von Papen, and Joseph Goebbels rushed to the scene. Standing amidst the smoke and showering embers, Hitler's face showed no shock, only grim triumph. "This is a God-given signal," he declared to Papen. "If this fire is the work of the communists, then there is no mercy for these murderers and subhumans." The narrative was set before the first fire hose was even turned on. This wasn't the lone act of a disturbed young man. It was the first shot in a massive communist revolution. Hermann Göring, Prussia's Minister of the Interior, arrived and immediately took charge. A man of brutal, decisive action, he announced to the press that his police had uncovered detailed plans for a communist takeover. They would seize key buildings, start a civil war, and plunge Germany into a Soviet-style nightmare. There was no evidence for any of this. It didn't matter. Fear is faster than facts. That night, the story spread through Berlin like the fire itself. The enemy was at the gates. The government had to act. The very next morning, Hitler presented his cabinet with the draft of an emergency decree. It had been written with astonishing speed, almost as if it were waiting for an excuse. The document was based on Article 48, the same presidential emergency power Hindenburg had been using for years. But this was different. This wasn't about balancing a budget. This was about rewriting the relationship between the citizen and the state. Hitler went to President Hindenburg. He painted a terrifying picture of imminent chaos, of a nation on the brink of collapse, threatened by a violent Red Terror. He argued that the Weimar Constitution, with its delicate protections for individual rights, was a luxury the nation could no longer afford. He wasn't asking for permanent new laws, just a temporary measure, a shield to protect the German people. The old field marshal, 85 years old and terrified of a Bolshevik uprising, did not need much convincing. He saw Hitler not as a radical revolutionary, but as a bulwark against a greater evil. He picked up his pen and signed the decree of the President of the Reich for the protection of people and state. With that single signature, the Weimar Constitution was effectively dead. Think about what this meant. Article 117, protecting the privacy of mail and telephone calls, suspended. Article 123, the right to assemble peacefully, suspended. Article 124, the freedom of speech and the press, suspended. Article 153, the protection of private property, suspended. The decree gave the central government power to take over state governments if they failed to maintain order. It gave the police the power to arrest and detain people indefinitely, without charge, without trial, without any access to a lawyer. This was called protective custody, a legal black hole from which there was no escape. And here is the most crucial part, the detail that turns this from a temporary emergency measure into the foundation of a totalitarian state. The decree contained no time limit, no expiration date, no provision for judicial review. It was a blank check for absolute power, signed by the president and handed directly to Hitler. In less than 24 hours, the legal framework for a police state was firmly in place. It would not be lifted for 12 years. The hammer fell immediately. That same night, Göring's Prussian police, now reinforced with thousands of SA and SS auxiliaries, began their work. They had lists, names of every known communist, socialist, and trade union leader, addresses of outspoken liberal journalists, troublesome artists, and pastors who had spoken against the Nazis. Doors were splintered open in the middle of the night. Men were dragged from their beds in front of their terrified families. They were thrown into the back of trucks and taken to makeshift prisons in abandoned warehouses and the basements of SA headquarters. The official charge was suspicion of treason. The real crime was political opposition. 4,000 people were arrested in the first few days alone. The debate over who truly started the Reichstag fire continues to this day. Was van der Lubbe acting alone? Was he a pawn in a communist plot? Or was it a sophisticated false flag operation orchestrated by the Nazis themselves? The evidence is murky, contradictory, and lost to time. But in the end, does it really matter who lit the match or who was ready to use the flames to burn down a democracy? The Nazis had a plan for an emergency. When that emergency arrived, they did not hesitate. With thousands of his political opponents now sitting in prisons without any legal rights, Hitler made his next move. The terror was not an end in itself. It was a tool, the necessary preparation for the final step. He went before the German people and called for one last election, to be held on March 5th. He promised it would give his government the clear majority it needed to finally save Germany. But how can you hold a free election when freedom itself no longer legally exists? How can you have a fair political debate when one side is in power and the other is in a concentration camp? Imagine you're going to vote. As you approach the polling station, you see men in military-style uniforms. They aren't soldiers. They're party thugs, recently given police badges. They don't say a word. They just watch. Their eyes follow you as you walk inside. Now imagine the only news you've heard for weeks is a constant stream of government propaganda, the only voice on the radio belonging to the man in power. This wasn't a hypothetical. This was the reality of the German election on March 5th, 1933. It was a vote designed not to choose a leader, but to legitimize a dictatorship that had already begun. The ashes of the Reichstag were still warm. The ink on Hindenburg's emergency decree was barely dry. Germany was living under a state of exception. Civil liberties were gone. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, all suspended in the name of protecting the state from a supposed communist uprising. Hitler now had the perfect weapon. The Reichstag fire decree was a legal crowbar to pry open German democracy and shatter it from within. And he had just 1 month until the election to use it. But a simple victory was never the goal. Hitler needed a landslide. He needed a 2/3 majority in the new parliament. That was the magic number. With 2/3 of the votes, he could legally change the Constitution itself. He could pass a law that would make him the law. This was the end game of the legal revolution, to have the system vote for its own destruction. The election had to provide the final stamp of approval. The state apparatus became the Nazi Party's campaign machine. Hermann Goering, now in control of the powerful Prussian police, wasted no time. He issued an order purging the force of anyone deemed politically unreliable. Thousands of Republican officers were fired. In their place, he deputized 50,000 men from the SA and the SS. The stormtroopers, the brawlers from the beer halls, were now the auxiliary police. They had the power of the state behind them. They could arrest, detain, and brutalize anyone they chose with total impunity. The opposition was systematically dismantled. The Communist Party was the first target. Its offices were raided, its printing presses smashed. 10,000 of its members were arrested in the first 2 weeks, including most of its parliamentary candidates. They were thrown into makeshift concentration camps, the first of their kind, set up in abandoned factories and warehouses. The terror was swift and brutal. The Social Democrats were next. Their meetings were banned. Their rallies were violently broken up by Göring's new auxiliary police. Their newspapers were shut down one by one. Their posters were torn from the walls. Their leaders were harassed, beaten, and arrested on fabricated charges. It became physically dangerous to be seen with a social democratic newspaper, let alone campaign for the party. Meanwhile, the Nazi propaganda machine under Joseph Goebbels was operating at full power. The radio, once a platform for diverse political views, now broadcast a single message 24 hours a day. Hitler's voice poured into every German living room. He wasn't a politician asking for votes. He was the savior promising national salvation. The message was simple and relentless. A vote for Hitler is a vote for Germany. A vote against him is a vote for communist chaos, for national humiliation, for the fire that burned the Reichstag. The campaign was a spectacle of power. Endless torchlight parades snaked through city streets. Giant rallies were staged with military precision. Swastika banners hung from every public building. The full resources of the government were used to promote a single party. There was no debate. There was no counter-argument. There was only the overwhelming noise of the Nazi movement, amplified by the state itself. On March 5, 1933, the German people went to the polls. The atmosphere was thick with fear and intimidation. Brown shirts lingered near polling stations, a silent reminder of the new reality. Many voters surely felt they had no choice, and yet they voted. The turnout was a massive 89%. As the results came in, it was clear the Nazis had won a huge victory. Their vote had surged to 17 million. They secured 288 seats. They were by far the largest party in the Reichstag. Goebbels declared it a revolution. It seemed Hitler had achieved his goal. But then came the final tally. The numbers told a more complicated story. The Nazi Party had won 43.9% of the vote. It was an enormous number, but it was not an absolute majority. And it was nowhere near the two-thirds supermajority Hitler needed to change the Constitution. Even more shocking were the results for the opposition. Despite the terror and suppression, the Social Democrats held their ground, winning over 7 million votes. The Communists, with their party banned and their leaders in prison, still managed to get nearly 5 million. Their mandates would later be canceled, but the votes themselves were a defiant message. Combined with the other parties, a majority of voters had cast their ballot for a party other than the Nazis. Think about that for a moment. Under the threat of violence, with the press silenced and the opposition jailed, a majority of Germans still refused to endorse Hitler's regime. In the last election that could even pretend to be free, they voted against him. This was a disaster for Hitler. His grand plan for a legal seizure of absolute power had failed at the final hurdle. The German people had not given him the mandate he craved. He had the chancellorship, the emergency powers, control of the police. But he did not have the votes in Parliament to make himself a dictator. The rules of the very Constitution he sought to destroy were still technically holding him back. He was stuck. The legal revolution had hit a wall. He couldn't change the Constitution, so he would have to find another way. What if he didn't need to change the law book piece by piece? What if he could convince the Reichstag to simply give its power away, all of it, to him? March 23, 1933. The German Parliament is not meeting in its grand historic building. That is a hollow, burnt-out shell. Instead, they gather in a theater, the Kroll Opera House. Outside, thousands of brown-shirted stormtroopers chant slogans, forming a menacing corridor for the arriving politicians. Inside, it's no better. SS men in black uniforms line the halls, their faces impassive, their presence a constant silent threat. On the agenda is a single bill with a long, reassuring name, the law to remedy the distress of the people and the Reich. But everyone knows it by its other name, the Enabling Act. It's a law that would allow Adolf Hitler to pass any legislation he wants for 4 years without Parliament's approval. The men and women in this room are being asked to vote themselves into irrelevance. They are being asked to formally, legally end democracy. The election on March 5th had been a disappointment for Hitler. The Nazi Party had won, but not with an absolute majority. Even with their nationalist allies, their hold on power was slim. It wasn't enough to change the Constitution, and that was the ultimate goal. He couldn't rely on President Hindenburg's emergency decrees forever. The old man was unpredictable. He could still fire him. Hitler needed a new tool, a legal instrument that would give him the power of a dictator, but with the stamp of parliamentary approval. The Enabling Act was that tool. As a constitutional amendment, it needed a 2/3 majority to pass, a majority he did not have. The session begins. The chamber is draped in swastika flags. The seats of the 81 communist deputies are empty. They are in jail or on the run or already dead. Their absence alone makes the 2/3 majority mathematically easier to achieve. Hermann Göring, now president of the Reichstag, presides over the session with an iron fist. The atmosphere is not one of debate, but of surrender. Then Adolf Hitler walks to the podium. This is not the screaming, frantic Hitler of the beer halls. This is the statesman, the chancellor. His voice is calm, measured. He speaks of restoring order and national unity. He makes promises. He promises to use the new powers sparingly, to protect the rights of the individual states. And then comes the most important part of his speech, a direct message to the one group whose votes he desperately needs, the Catholic Center Party. He promises to respect the rights of the Christian churches, to uphold their schools and their values. He presents himself not as a radical revolutionary, but as a protector of German tradition against the godless threat of communism. It is a masterful performance of reassurance, a lie wrapped in a promise. After Hitler finishes, the opposition is given its chance to speak. For the Social Democrats, this is the last stand. Their leader, Otto Wels, makes his way to the front, walking past rows of armed SA men standing inside the chamber itself, their eyes following his every move. His speech is an act of breathtaking courage. He looks directly at the Nazi benches and speaks of justice, freedom, and humanity. He reminds the chamber of the Social Democrats' long fight for German democracy. He turns to Hitler and delivers a line that will echo through history. "You can take our lives and our freedom, but you cannot take our honor." The chamber is silent for a moment. Then chaos erupts. Hitler is on his feet, his face twisted with fury. The mask of the calm statesman is gone. He rushes back to the podium, unscripted, shaking with rage. He screams at Wels, calling the Social Democrats traitors. "I do not want your votes," he shrieks. "Germany will be free, but not through you." In that moment, the entire room sees the real face of the regime, the violent, intolerant reality lurking just beneath the thin veneer of legality. Now, everything depends on the Center Party. Their leader, a Catholic priest named Ludwig Kaas, had been negotiating with Hitler for days. He was trapped. The Nazis had the power of the state, Göring's police, the stormtroopers on the streets. Resistance seemed futile, perhaps even suicidal. Civil war was a real possibility. Hitler had offered a deal, their votes in exchange for the safety of the church, a written guarantee. It was a devil's bargain. Protect your own flock, but sacrifice the entire democratic state to the wolves. Was this a pragmatic choice to save what could be saved? Or was it an act of political cowardice, a catastrophic misreading of the man they were dealing with? Kaas and his party made their decision. They would vote yes. They convinced themselves this was a temporary measure for a national emergency. They believed Hitler's promises. They believed they could work with him, perhaps even control him. It was a calculation that would prove catastrophically wrong. The vote begins. It's a roll call. Each deputy's name is read aloud. One by one, they stand and declare their vote. The Social Democrats, all 94 who are present, vote no. Their voices are firm, defiant. But then come the others, the nationalists, the conservatives, and then the Center Party. Yes, yes, yes. The words fall like hammer blows on the coffin of the Weimar Republic. The final tally is announced. 444 votes in favor, 94 against. The Enabling Act has passed. The chamber erupts. The Nazi deputies leap to their feet and begin to sing the Horst Wessel Lied, their party anthem. Their voices fill the opera house, a triumphant roar drowning out the last gasps of a dying democracy. The conservatives and the centrists who voted with them clap politely. Franz von Papen, the man who thought he could control Hitler, is seen smiling. They all believe they have just granted temporary emergency powers to a government they can manage. They have no idea they have just signed a blank check for absolute tyranny. The Reichstag has formally committed suicide. The law of the land is now whatever Adolf Hitler and his cabinet decide it is. He no longer needs Parliament. He no longer needs the President's signature. He holds all legislative power in his hands, granted to him by the very institutions he swore to destroy. He is, for all intents and purposes, a legal dictator. Where does a man with absolute power begin? A country isn't just one government. It's thousands of smaller ones. The state parliament in Bavaria, the city council in Hamburg, the trade union in the Ruhr Valley, the local shooting club, the farmers' association, the Veterans League. Each is a small pocket of independent power, a place where people organize their own lives. In the spring of 1933, with the Enabling Act in his hands, Adolf Hitler set out to conquer them all. The plan had a name, a clean, bureaucratic, almost sterile name that hid its brutal reality: Gleichschaltung, coordination. It was a legal blitzkrieg designed to bring every aspect of German life under Nazi control. The Enabling Act was a loaded weapon, and Hitler wasted no time pulling the trigger. His first target wasn't an enemy political party, but the very structure of Germany itself. For centuries, Germany had been a collection of proud, independent states. Bavaria, Prussia, Saxony, they had their own governments, their own police forces, their own deeply rooted traditions. They were potential centers of resistance. On March 31st, 1933, just 1 week after gaining dictatorial power, the new regime issued its first decree, the Provisional Law on the Coordination of the States with the Reich. It was a work of chilling legal genius. The law simply dissolved every state parliament in the country. Then it ordered them to be reformed, instantly, based on the results of the national election from March 5th, the election where the Nazis had won 43.9% of the vote. In one move, without a single shot fired, the Nazis automatically gained control of almost every state legislature in Germany. Local democracy was erased with the stroke of a pen. But that was only step one. A week later, a second law followed. This one created a new position, the Reichsstatthalter, or Reich Governor. These were not elected officials. They were Hitler's personal viceroys, loyal partymen sent to each state, men like Franz von Papen in Bavaria. Their job was to ensure the states followed orders from Berlin. They had the power to appoint and dismiss mayors, to command the local police, to pass laws. The ancient flags of Bavaria and Saxony were lowered. The swastika was raised in their place. The centuries-old federal structure of Germany was dismantled in less than 2 weeks. It didn't happen with a civil war. It happened with a memo. With the states neutralized, the regime turned its eyes to another massive source of independent power, the German trade unions. They were a giant of German society, with millions of members, huge financial reserves, and a long history of organizing workers against extremist politics. Politically aligned with the Social Democrats, the Nazis' most hated enemy, the unions were a fortress. Hitler knew he couldn't lay siege to it. He had to take it by deception. The plan was set for May 1st, May Day, the traditional day of international worker solidarity, a day celebrated by socialists and communists for decades, and a day the Nazis had always despised. But in 1933, they did something shocking. They declared May 1st a paid national holiday, calling it the Day of National Labor. For the first time in German history, the entire country would celebrate its workers. The regime organized colossal parades, rallies, and firework displays, flying in hundreds of workers' delegations from all over Germany to Berlin. That evening, Hitler stood before a crowd of over 100,000 people at Tempelhof Field. He didn't scream or threaten. He spoke of honor, of unity, of breaking down the class barriers that divided the nation. He praised the German worker as the backbone of the Reich. "We have the unshakable will," he declared, "to unite all Germans, to create a new German people." For many Union members, it was a confusing, even hopeful moment. Perhaps a compromise was possible. Perhaps the new government truly wanted to work with them. They went to bed that night with a cautious optimism, walking into a perfectly laid trap. The next morning, May 2nd, at 10 o'clock sharp, the trap was sprung. All across Germany, simultaneously, SA stormtroopers and police stormed every trade union office in the country. They kicked down doors, smashed furniture, and seized control of the buildings. They arrested every union leader they could find, from the national chairman down to the local secretaries. Men were dragged from their desks, beaten, and thrown into makeshift prisons. At the same time, the government seized all of the union's assets, their bank accounts, their property, their printing presses, everything. In a few hours, the entire German labor movement, an institution built over 75 years, was annihilated. Imagine you're a union member in Hamburg. You went to the parade on May 1st. You listened to the radio broadcast of Hitler's speech. The next morning, you go to your local union hall to pay your dues, and you find the doors chained. You see a swastika flag hanging from the window. The man who used to help you with your pension is gone, and a man in a brown shirt is sitting at his desk. He tells you your old union doesn't exist anymore. In its place was a new organization, the German Labor Front, the DF. Run by a fanatical Nazi named Robert Ley, the DAF was not a union. It did not represent workers, it represented the state. Membership became effectively mandatory if you wanted to keep your job. Strikes were outlawed. The Labor Front dictated wages, working hours, and vacation time. It was a giant nationwide cage designed not to protect the worker, but to control him. In just over a month, the Nazis had achieved two massive victories. They had broken the backs of the independent states, turning them into mere administrative districts of Berlin, and they had shattered the organized working class, the one group with the numbers and discipline to potentially resist them. The board was being cleared, the regional power centers were gone, the organized workers were silenced, but a few pieces still remained. Other political parties still technically existed: the Social Democrats, the Center Party, the Conservatives. They were weakened, intimidated, and surrounded, but they were still there. The Nazis had taken over the states and the unions. Now they had to deal with their political rivals. How do you get rid of your opponents in a country where you now write all the laws? First, they came for the communists. Then they came for the Social Democrats. By the summer of 1933, the Nazis' conservative allies, the very men who put Hitler in power, realized they were next. The revolution they had helped unleash was now coming for them. The Enabling Act was less than 3 months old, but its power had been used with brutal efficiency. The federal states were neutered. The trade unions, a pillar of the republic, had been smashed in a single day. The process was called Gleichschaltung, coordination. It was a clean bureaucratic word for a hostile takeover of an entire nation. Now Hitler turned his attention to the final obstacle: other political parties. The board was already being cleared. The communists were effectively destroyed after the Reichstag fire. Their leaders were in concentration camps or in exile, their assets seized. The Social Democratic Party, the oldest in Germany, was next. On May 10th, police under Hermann Göring's command occupied their buildings and confiscated their funds, accusing them of being enemies of the state. On June 22nd, the party was officially banned. Its members in the Reichstag were stripped of their seats. Just like that, the architects of the Weimar Republic were erased from political life. But what about the others? The conservatives, the liberals, the centrists. They had watched the assault on the left with grim satisfaction, some even cheering it on. They saw it as a necessary cleansing, a restoration of order. They were Hitler's partners, after all. Franz von Papen was vice-chancellor. Alfred Hugenberg, leader of the nationalists, was the economics minister. They were inside the government. They believed they were safe. They believed they were in control. This was their greatest, most fatal miscalculation. They failed to understand that for Hitler, a partner was just an opponent he hadn't eliminated yet. The pressure began subtly. SA stormtroopers started appearing outside the offices of other parties. Meetings were observed. Whispers in dark corridors turned into direct threats. Newspapers that dared to offer even mild criticism were shut down by local police for endangering public order. The message was clear. There is no room for dissent. Not anymore. The smaller parties crumbled first. The German State Party, a liberal group, voted to dissolve itself on June 28th. They saw the writing on the wall. Resistance was pointless. It would only lead to arrests and persecution. It was better to disappear quietly. Then came a much bigger target, the Catholic Center Party. This was the party that had held the balance of power for years. Their vote had been crucial in passing the Enabling Act. They had believed Hitler's promises to respect the Church and preserve a degree of Christian influence. They thought they had secured a deal. In reality, they had handed him the weapon he would use to destroy them. Imagine being a leader of the Center Party in July 1933. You see your allies on the left being crushed. You see Nazi stormtroopers on every street corner. You hear Hitler on the radio every night speaking of a unified national community, a single will, a single movement. The deal you thought you had, the concordat with the Vatican to protect Catholic rights, now seems like a flimsy shield. Hitler's government dangled it in front of them, a prize for their cooperation. The implication was chillingly clear. Dissolve your party, and maybe we will honor the agreement. Oppose us, and you will lose everything. On July 5th, facing immense pressure and intimidation, the Center Party announced its own dissolution. They had been played perfectly. The dominoes fell faster now. The Bavarian People's Party, a conservative Catholic group, followed a day later. The final, most humiliating act was reserved for Alfred Hugenberg's nationalists, the DNVP. These were the old-school conservatives, the aristocrats and industrialists who looked down on Hitler as a vulgar upstart. They were the ones who invited him into government, who were supposed to be the senior partners. Hugenberg was forced to resign from the cabinet. His party was pressured to merge with the Nazis in a show of national unity. It was a complete surrender. The party that represented the old German Empire simply ceased to exist, absorbed into the movement it had intended to control. Franz von Papen, the master strategist who would box Hitler in, now found himself a vice-chancellor with no political party to back him. He was a general with no army, a title with no power. He was utterly alone, a guest in a government that now held him in contempt. With every other political organization either banned or coerced into suicide, the final step was a mere formality. On July 14, 1933, the Nazi government passed the Law Against the Formation of New Parties. Its text was simple and absolute. The Nazi Party was now the only political party in Germany. Any attempt to maintain another party or to form a new one was a criminal offense punishable by years of hard labor. In less than 6 months, Germany had gone from a chaotic, multi-party democracy to a legally enforced one-party state. There was no civil war, no mass uprising. The Constitution was never formally abolished. It was simply rendered irrelevant. It was all done through decrees, through intimidation, through laws passed by a terrified and broken parliament. The system had been convinced to legislate its own death. The victory seemed total. Every external enemy had been vanquished. The communists, the Democrats, the unions, the other parties, all gone. The political stage belonged to Adolf Hitler alone. But politics, like nature, abhors a vacuum. When all your external enemies are defeated, the only place left to find them is closer to home. Hitler had consolidated his power over Germany, but what about the enemy within his own movement? By the summer of 1933, the war for Germany seemed over. The communists were in camps, the Social Democrats were crushed, and the other parties had simply vanished. A new law made the Nazi Party the sole political force in the nation. Adolf Hitler had won. He was the undisputed leader of a one-party state. But his most dangerous enemy wasn't in a prison cell or in exile. He was inside the house. By 1934, the most powerful man in Germany, besides Hitler himself, was arguably his oldest friend, Ernst Röhm. Röhm was a barrel-chested, scarred brawler, a soldier from the very beginning, and he commanded an army of 3 million loyal stormtroopers, the SA. These were the men in brown shirts who had fought for Hitler in the streets, broken up rival meetings, and terrorized opponents into silence. They were the engine of the revolution. And now, with political victory secured, they expected their reward. They wanted a second revolution. But Germany wasn't big enough for 2 armies. The problem was simple. The revolution had stopped halfway. For Hitler, the goal was achieved. He had control of the state, and now it was time to work with the existing powers, the industrialists who funded him, the bureaucrats who ran the ministries, and most importantly, the German army, the Reichswehr. But for Ernst Röhm and his followers, this was a betrayal. They looked around and saw the same old faces in charge, the same aristocratic generals, the same wealthy factory owners. They had fought to tear down the old system, not to give it a new coat of paint. Röhm's vision was radical. He believed The SA was the true army of the new Germany, a people's army born from the revolutionary spirit of National Socialism. He openly mocked the professional Reichswehr as a stuffy, old-fashioned club for aristocrats. His plan was blunt. The SA would absorb the Reichswehr. His 3 million stormtroopers would become the foundation of Germany's new military, and he, Ernst Röhm, would be at its head. He wasn't subtle about it. "I am the Scharnhorst of the new Germany," he told anyone who would listen, a direct claim to be the great reformer of the military. This was more than just ambition. It was an existential threat to the German officer corps. Imagine being a German general in 1934. Your family has served in the army for generations. You believe in discipline, tradition, and order. You look at the SA, and you don't see soldiers. You see an undisciplined mob of thugs and brawlers, good for a street fight, but useless on a real battlefield. The thought of this brown-shirted rabble becoming the German army wasn't just insulting, it was terrifying. It was the end of their world. Hitler was caught in a vice. On one side, he had the SA, his most loyal followers, the men who had literally shed blood for him. They were the soul of the party's radical wing. To turn against them would be to turn against his own past and risk splintering his movement. Röhm wasn't just a subordinate. He was one of the few people who addressed Hitler with the informal "du." They were old comrades. On the other side stood the Reichswehr, an institution of only 100,000 men, limited by the Treaty of Versailles. But these were professional soldiers. They had the expertise, the tradition, the institutional knowledge. Hitler wasn't just thinking about controlling Germany. He was already thinking about conquering Europe. For that, he didn't need a mob. He needed a professional, disciplined, modern army. The SA could keep order in Berlin. The Reichswehr could take Paris. The generals made their position perfectly clear. They went to Hitler and to the aging President Hindenburg, delivering an ultimatum cloaked in the polite language of military necessity. The choice was his. Either them, the professional army of the German state, or Röhm's private militia. They would not be absorbed. They would not serve under him. If Hitler failed to deal with the SA, the army might be forced to deal with the situation itself, a veiled threat of a military coup. The tension in Germany became electric. The SA grew more arrogant, marching through the streets, singing songs about sharpening their long knives. They brawled with soldiers and police, acting like they already owned the country. Röhm himself became increasingly reckless, drinking heavily and openly criticizing Hitler's caution. "Adolf is a civilian," he sneered. "He's letting the generals run circles around him." This is where the story gets darker. Was the threat from Röhm real? Was he actively planning to overthrow Hitler? Or was he just a loud, ambitious man who had become inconvenient? We know that other Nazi leaders, like Heinrich Himmler of the SS and Hermann Göring, saw Röhm as a direct rival. The SS was still technically part of the SA, and Himmler longed for independence. Göring wanted control over all armed forces. They began to feed Hitler a steady diet of whispers and fabricated reports, compiling a dossier on a supposed Röhm putsch. They painted a picture of a conspiracy, of an imminent betrayal by his oldest friend. The line between a real threat and a convenient lie began to blur. Hitler was a man who saw conspiracies everywhere, but he was also a master political calculator. He owed Röhm a debt of loyalty, but he needed the army for his ultimate goals. The army offered him something the SA never could: legitimacy in the eyes of the old conservative elite and the key to his plans for war. The generals promised that if Hitler settled the SA problem, the army would swear an oath of personal loyalty, not to Germany, not to the Constitution, but to him. The choice became brutally simple. It was a choice between the past and the future, between the revolutionary comrades who put him in power and the professional soldiers he needed for his vision of conquest. It was a choice between his friend and his ambition. The German army had given Hitler an ultimatum. The SA was growing more rebellious by the day. How does a dictator solve a problem like this when all his opponents are inside his own house? He doesn't negotiate. He doesn't compromise. He prepares a list. For 72 hours in the summer of 1934, the law in Germany ceased to exist. Hitler declared himself the supreme judge of the German people and unleashed his SS to hunt down and execute his oldest friends and bitterest enemies, all without a single trial. The year before, he had conquered the state. Now he faced an enemy within his own movement, Ernst Röhm, leader of the SA, the Brown Shirts, the man who had stood by Hitler's side since the earliest days in the beer halls of Munich. Röhm commanded an army of 3 million stormtroopers. They were the street brawlers, the thugs who had broken up communist meetings and terrorized political opponents. They had been the engine of the Nazi rise to power, and now they felt cheated. They had expected a true revolution, one that would sweep away not just the politicians, but the old money industrialists and the aristocratic army generals. Röhm spoke openly of a second revolution. He saw his SA as the seed of a new people's army, one that would absorb the professional military, the Reichswehr. To the German generals, this was not just an insult, it was an existential threat. The army was the bedrock of the old German state. They would not be replaced by what they saw as an undisciplined mob. Hitler was caught in the middle. He needed the army. Their discipline, expertise, and loyalty were essential for his future plans. But he owed his power to Röhm and the SA. The tension grew throughout the spring of 1934. The generals made their position clear. It was either them or Röhm. There was no room for both in the new Germany. Heinrich Himmler and his deputy, Reinhard Heydrich, saw their opportunity. Their black-uniformed SS was still technically a part of the SA, but they were disciplined, loyal only to Hitler, and they despised Röhm's chaotic ambition. They began compiling a file. They fabricated evidence of a plot, a Röhm putsch. They collected lists of names, not just SA leaders, but everyone who had ever crossed Hitler, every old enemy, every inconvenient ally. The code name for the operation was Hummingbird. On the 29th of June, Hitler flew to Essen for a wedding, projecting an image of calm, of business as usual. But the SS was already moving into position across Germany. The trap was set. In the early hours of June 30th, the call came. Hitler flew to Munich, his face a mask of cold fury. He was no longer a politician. He was a warlord about to destroy his own lieutenants. His convoy sped towards a lakeside hotel in Bad Wiese, where Ernst Röhm and other SA leaders were sleeping. Hitler himself, pistol in hand, led the charge into the hotel. Doors were kicked in. Men were dragged from their beds, half awake and confused. Röhm was arrested personally by Hitler, accused of treason. The shock on the faces of his oldest comrades was absolute. They had worshipped this man, and he had come to kill them. All across Germany, the purge began. In Berlin, Hermann Göring directed the operation from his headquarters. Squads of SS men armed with lists fanned out across the city. They went to the home of former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher, the general who had tried to split the Nazi Party. They shot him at his desk. His wife was killed when she tried to shield him with her body. They found Gregor Strasser, Hitler's former rival for leadership of the party, a man once powerful enough to challenge him. He was arrested, taken to a prison cell, and shot through a window. They rounded up associates of Vice-Chancellor von Papen, the man who thought he could control Hitler. His office was ransacked, his closest aides murdered. Papen himself was placed under house arrest, his power and his arrogance shattered forever. The killing went on for 3 days. SA leaders were taken to barracks in Berlin or to Stadelheim prison in Munich. They were stood against a wall and executed by firing squad. There were no trials, no judges, no appeals, just a name on a list and a bullet. The official death toll was 85. The real number was likely hundreds more. The SA, the mighty stormtroopers, was broken overnight. Its leadership was dead, its power gone. And what was the reaction from the pillars of the German state, the ones who were supposed to uphold the law? There was no outcry, no constitutional crisis. The German army, the institution most threatened by Röhm, was overjoyed. The defense minister, General von Blomberg, publicly thanked Hitler for his soldierly decision and exemplary courage, praising him for crushing the traitors. They weren't horrified by the lawless massacre. They were grateful. Hitler had just murdered their biggest rival, and they owed him for it. On July 13th, Hitler stood before the Reichstag. He did not apologize. He did not make excuses. He declared that in a moment of supreme danger to the nation, he had acted as the supreme judge of the German people. He announced a new law, consisting of a single sentence, which declared that the measures taken were legal acts of self-defense by the state. He had committed mass murder, and then his own rubber-stamp parliament declared it legal after the fact. The message was clear. There was no law above Adolf Hitler. He was the law. After the speech, the cameras captured Hitler being greeted by his cabinet. These men, ministers of justice, finance, foreign affairs, are not somber. They are not afraid. They are smiling. They shake his hand, congratulating him. They understood the new reality. Loyalty was survival. Anything else was a death sentence. Hitler had now eliminated every source of potential opposition. The political parties were gone. The trade unions were gone. Now the internal threat from his own party was gone. The conservative elites and the army had not just allowed it to happen. They had applauded it. He had murdered his rivals, and the army had thanked him for it. Only one man in Germany held a higher office, the frail 86-year-old President Hindenburg. What would happen when he died? An oath of loyalty can be to a constitution. It can be to an idea, a flag, a nation, or it can be to a man. On August 2nd, 1934, every soldier in the German army was forced to make that choice. Their decision would seal the fate of the world. The summer of 1934 was warm and still. At his country estate in Neudeck, President Paul von Hindenburg was dying. At 86 years old, the old field marshal, the victor of Tannenberg, the living symbol of old Prussia, was fading. His world was one of memory, of emperors and generals, of a Germany that no longer existed. His breath was shallow, his mind wandering through the fog of the past. The air around his deathbed was thick with the scent of pine trees and the heavy silence of impending loss. It was a slow, quiet, dignified end for a man of a bygone era. But in Berlin, there was no quiet. There was no dignity. There was only a frantic, predatory waiting. In the Reich Chancellery, the air was electric with anticipation. Adolf Hitler and his inner circle weren't mourning. They were watching the clock. Every report from Neudeck was analyzed. Every shallow breath of the president was a countdown. This wasn't a vigil. It was a death watch. They knew the Constitution dictated a new presidential election upon Hindenburg's death. That was a risk. An election meant uncertainty, a chance for an opponent to rally. Hitler had no intention of allowing that. The plan was already in place. The legal paperwork was already drafted. Back at his estate, Hindenburg, in his final moments of delirium, saw Hitler standing at his bedside. The old man's eyes, clouded with age, failed to recognize the chancellor he had so reluctantly appointed. Instead, he saw a ghost from his past, his old master, Kaiser Wilhelm II. With a weak, raspy voice, he addressed Hitler, calling him Your Majesty. It was the clash of two worlds in one room. The last breath of the German Empire, unknowingly anointing the first breath of the Third Reich. On August 1st, as Hindenburg slipped into his final coma, the cabinet convened in Berlin. There was no debate, no discussion. It was a formality, executed with cold precision. A law was passed, a single page of text that would rewrite the future of Germany. It was called the Law Concerning the Head of State of the German Reich. Simple, elegant, and utterly devastating. It stated that upon the death of President von Hindenburg, the office of the president would be merged with the office of the chancellor. The powers of both would be combined and transferred to Adolf Hitler. He would now hold a new title, Führer and Reich Chancellor, head of state, head of government, and, most critically, supreme commander of the armed forces. It was a legal coup, timed to the minute. The next morning, on August 2nd, at 9 o'clock, Paul von Hindenburg died. The news was broadcast to the nation, and in the very same announcement, the public was informed of the new law. There was no gap, no moment of transition, no window for any opposition to form. Hitler had not seized power. He had simply absorbed it, legally, seamlessly, and completely. The final piece of the puzzle was the army, the Reichswehr, the one institution in Germany with the physical power to stop him. The army had been wary of Hitler, disgusted by the thuggish SA, but just 1 month earlier, on the night of the Long Knives, Hitler had eliminated the SA's leadership. He had murdered Ernst Röhm, ending the threat of a second revolution and the SA's ambition to absorb the regular army. The generals were not horrified by the bloodshed. They were relieved. They were grateful. The Minister of War, General Werner von Blomberg, saw an opportunity. Blomberg was an ambitious man, a sycophant, eager to prove his loyalty to the new regime. He saw Hitler as the savior who had protected the army's honor and status. Out of a toxic mix of gratitude, ambition, and a deep-seated fear of a communist takeover, he made a fateful proposal. He suggested that the army should demonstrate its allegiance to the new Führer. It should swear a new oath. This was a radical break with centuries of German tradition. The old oath was sworn to the Constitution, to the Volk and Vaterland, the people and the fatherland. It was an oath to an institution, to an idea. The new oath, drafted by Blomberg and his aides, was different. It was personal. It was absolute. Imagine a barracks courtyard in the early morning light. Thousands of soldiers, from young recruits to grizzled veterans, stand in perfect formation. An officer steps forward, unrolls a scroll, and reads the new words aloud, his voice echoing across the parade ground. I swear by God this sacred oath, that I will render unconditional obedience to the Führer of the German Reich and people, Adolf Hitler, the supreme commander of the armed forces, and that I will be ready as a brave soldier to risk my life at any time for this oath. Unconditional obedience, not to Germany, not to a constitution, to a man, Adolf Hitler. You can picture the faces in the ranks, the young fanatics, their eyes gleaming with fervor, for whom this was the moment they had been waiting for. The older officers, career soldiers, their faces like stone, perhaps a flicker of doubt in their eyes. They understood the gravity of these words. They were professional soldiers, and an oath was an unbreakable bond. And then there were the ordinary men, the conscripts, confused perhaps, but trained to follow orders. We can only guess what many truly thought, but a diary entry from one German captain captures the chilling reality. He wrote of an oath that bound them not to an idea, but to a man's pulse. He wrote of tying the fate of the German army to the heartbeat of a single human being. And then he asked, what happens if that pulse is mad? What have we done? What they had done was transform the last potential guardian of the Republic into Hitler's personal instrument. The one force that could have overthrown him was now legally and spiritually bound to obey his every command, no matter how depraved. But even this was not enough for Hitler. He needed more than the loyalty of the army. He needed the illusion of the people's total consent. On August 19th, a national plebiscite was held. The German people were asked a single question. Did they approve of merging the offices of President and Chancellor and of accepting Adolf Hitler as their Führer? It was not a free choice. It was a masterpiece of coercive propaganda. Posters appeared everywhere showing a heroic dying Hindenburg, his hand on Hitler's shoulder as if passing a sacred torch. The message was clear. The old hero chose his successor. Radio broadcasts blared non-stop, telling Germans that a yes vote was a vote for unity, for strength, for the fatherland. A no vote was an act of treason. At the polling stations, the air was thick with intimidation. Brown-shirted SA men loitered outside, watching everyone who entered. They offered help to the elderly and infirm, looking over their shoulders as they marked their ballots. The secret ballot was a complete fiction. To vote no was to openly defy the men standing right in front of you The results came in. Nearly 90% of Germans voted yes. It was a staggering victory. The propaganda machine celebrated it as the unified voice of the German people. But look closer at the numbers. Over 4 million people, nearly 10% of the electorate, still dared to vote no. 4 million souls, in the face of overwhelming pressure and open threats, had the courage to defy him. It was a silent, desperate act of resistance, but it was powerless. The legal revolution was complete. In just 19 months, Adolf Hitler had gone from being a chancellor supposedly boxed in by conservatives to the absolute, legally untouchable dictator of Germany. The very institution that could have stopped him, the army, had voluntarily sworn itself into his service. Was this oath the single most important moment in his consolidation of power? Could the Second World War have happened if Germany's generals felt loyal to their country instead of to their Führer? From a fringe politician to an absolute dictator in just 4 years, all under the guise of the law. The question isn't just how he did it. The question we must ask is, could the same legal blueprint be used to dismantle a democracy today?